Thanks for tuning in to TellyCast. Before you listen to the show, I wanted to let you know about our next event, the TellyCast Digital Content Forum, sponsored by BBC Studios. It's the only event in the UK exploring the opportunities, trends and commerce in digital-first video. It's happening on Thursday, November the 9th at London's BFI South Bank and features keynote addresses from TikTok, Snap and Banijay. Network with creators and industry leaders and experience panel sessions on funding, branded content, formats, the crossover between TV and social first video, and more. For tickets and more information, visit telecast.com/events. But hurry, last year's event sold out, so secure yours now. The TellyCast Digital Content Forum, sponsored by BBC Studios. We'll see you there.
TellyCast.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome to another TellyCast. TV advertising has seen a massive decline in 2023, sending shockwaves across the content industry and hampering commissioning and new production. There's lots of reasons for this, of course, but on this week's show, we're focusing on a very specific area of TV advertising, and that's connected TV. I wanted to find out how advertisers are viewing connected TV, fast channel adoption, and get a handle on the outlook for CTV and TV advertising as a whole. Specifically, when things are going to improve and when we might see movement in commissioning from commercial broadcasters. It's coming right up on this week's TellyCast. My guest on this week's TellyCast is Alex Brownsell, Head of Content at WARC, the World Advertising Research Centre. Welcome to TellyCast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you on the show, Alex. We spoke to your colleague James McDonald at Cannes Lions this year, just to get a bit of a sense around the TV advertising market. And obviously that has been relatively down this year and added to all the other things that we all know about, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, everything else that's sort of pushing down demand for new programming that the industry's suffering through. But what I thought we'd do is have a bit of a catch-up chat. And I know that you've published a new report around TV advertising and specifically around connected TV advertising, right, which we'll dip into in a second. First of all, can you just remind our TV industry listeners a little bit about what it is that you do at WARC?
As you may have heard in the podcast with James, we're experts in marketing effectiveness. So we look at what's happening in the global world of marketing, very much from a sort of data-driven, research-driven point of view, evidence-driven point of view. My role within WARC is as head of content of our media product. So I oversee all the reports, the content that we put out that relates specifically to media, which obviously TV is a pretty big pillar. And there's a few different report series we do. One of them in particular is called Global Ad Trends. It's our quarterly report. It's a flagship report that we do where we take a load of data, our own data. We look at some of the stuff that's out there from other sources in the industry as well. And we try and build out a bit of a narrative. That could be looking at something that maybe we think an area people have ignored. It could be trying to take a sort of popular point of view and maybe just take a closer look to see if that is a bit of a myth. And that was one of the things that really motivated us with this connected TV report, because within the world of advertising, CTV, connected TV, CTV, sorry, to already drop into acronyms, there's a huge buzz around it. A lot of the industry are very excited about it. The media owners, the broadcasters are very excited about it to a degree, which we can come on to later. And particularly this sort of middle segment of advertising technology companies are very excited about it as well, particularly because they think that it can bring digital addressability to the sort of mass reach world of television. We wanted to get under the hood. We wanted to see what was going on. And that was kind of where the report came from.
To the non-sort of ad tech savvy listeners, which I think are probably a lot of our listeners, when we're talking about connected TV and addressability, that's essentially understanding who is watching a particular program, where they are, all of their data, and just delivering much more effective advertising, whereas at the moment in linear advertising, it's much more difficult to track that. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. Just to sort of split that out a little bit, connected TV is very device oriented. That's much more to do with the delivery mechanism for the television content. So it's kind of the polar opposite of broadcast television or cable television, that linear TV experience that's so familiar to all of us. Connected TV is where the device that you're watching that TV content on is connected to the internet. So that includes all forms of streaming, essentially. The addressability point is more of a technical term, as you described, to do with the advertising. So at the moment, as you say, in linear TV and broadcast television, you'll have an idea of the region in which your advert will be running, or the country market that your advert will be running. And you'll be able to sort of get some contextual cues from the content. So if it's sports content, maybe you could infer something about the audience. If it's soap opera, similarly. But you can't really drill down beyond that until some of the more recent technological innovations. The idea with CTV is, theoretically, you know that households, you know perhaps the street they live on, how many cars they've got, what sort of affluence we're talking about, you know, what their disposable income is. And then you can start to make some slightly more inferred decisions about whether or not you want the ad to be served to them. It's a lot harder to do than it sounds, because we're so used to that type of targeting through our mobile phones in the world of digital. In TV, it's quite tricky. It's also not new, is the funny thing. I mean, Sky with AdSmart have been doing this for a decade now and slowly refining it, but it's not been easy. You'll still watch a lot of ads that, frankly, are relevant to nobody living in your house. We can come on to a separate point, which is a lot of actually advertising experts think that there's nothing wrong with that, because what you want to do is you want to build your reach, you want to build your future demand by talking to people who aren't necessarily in market for your product. But nevertheless, brands really love the idea. If you're a car marketer, you love the idea that you can target people who might be in the market for a new car, rather than wasting, inverted commas, a load of your budget on people who couldn't care less. That's the theory.
And to that point, so a car manufacturer is looking to target a particular type of individual in a particular region. Is it possible to also tailor that specific ad to that region? If, for example, if there's a local dealership or driving consumers into local stores, can you tailor it to that level?
Yeah, you absolutely can do, yeah. Part of that will come down to your capacity in terms of how many different variations of the same advert you're willing to create. But you're right, for a car company, you absolutely do it down to dealership level, and I think plenty have. The irony, of course, is that takes us back to local TV and what local TV was doing 30 years ago. But anyway, that's a separate point. What you can't do, partly due to the limitations of the technology, partly due to data privacy, is you can't go to an individual level. You can't say, Alex, we think you're going to be in the market for a car in 6 months' time. Why don't you pop down to this dealership around the corner and come and visit us? That's not possible for a number of reasons. But, I don't know who'd want to do that in TV anyway. I think people would be freaked out. It'd be very Minority Report, wouldn't it?
Yeah, would it be like somebody coming round the front door and knocking on your door and dragging you out of the house and getting you down to the dealership? Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. And I can clearly see why marketeers would want to be as efficient, as targeted as possible, and in a way that they haven't been able to be before. Just before we talk about the reports, Alex, connected TV, for the purposes of this report, how are you defining connected TV? Is it to do with purely televisions in the old style, when we were talking about smart TVs, or are we including handsets? Are we talking about mobile phones within this? How are we defining it for the purposes of this report?
It's a really good question, and I do have an answer, but it's not necessarily the right answer, because there are so many shades of grey here. But for this report, we've defined connected TV as all sort of digital, professionally produced video that appears on TV screens. So we're very much focused on the TV device here. So it'll include all sorts of the stuff you can imagine, your Netflixes, all your subscription video on demand services, FAST, which we can get onto later, those FAST services. What we don't include is YouTube, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have the data to break out what viewing is happening on a TV device versus on a mobile device with YouTube. We know a lot of YouTube is being watched on TV screens, but partly due to the lack of data, partly because we're focusing on that professionally produced video, that classic TV piece, is we've decided to sort of push that to one side. It's not perfect. It's actually how a lot of the industry does look at connected TV, a lot of the advertising industry, I should say, and the way that the budget is allocated. A lot of brands will have a budget for professional AV, audiovisual content, that is traditionally what has gone to TV and is now maybe being split in a few different places. YouTube comes out of the online video and the social media budget, so it's a bit different. So that's why we do it the way we do it. It doesn't always make sense, but that's the rationale.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's really helpful for this report, and particularly when we're talking about the inverted commas more traditional TV industry, because I've seen lots of reports in the past where YouTube has been kind of lumped in, and it just feels like it's relatively unwieldy and doesn't really get to the detail because it's such a massive business and there's so much advertising on there that it sort of distorts the figures.
Exactly. And if you're including YouTube, why aren't you including TikTok? It sort of takes you to different places, I think.
So tell us about the speed of connected TV adoption. I mean, it is a relatively new technology. When you said that, some of the addressable TV tech has been around for a decade or so, but connected TV is something that's growing. Give us an idea about the speed of connected TV adoption right now and where that sits in relation to linear TV.
The thing that's absolutely happening at a really, really fast rate is that a lot of households are becoming, inverted commas, CTV enabled. That's to say that they have a TV device in their homes that can stream TV content. And that's obviously different from the old style tellies that you couldn't do this with, or you had to sort of, plug in various devices and cables and all the rest of it. I think we have a stat in the report that more than 4/5 of households in the US are now CTV enabled. I don't have the stat to hand for Europe, but Europe isn't far behind. Western Europe isn't far behind. And I think that's a inevitable consequence of the fact that people own more smart TVs now than they used to. If you're going into the market to buy a TV now, chances are you're going to buy a smart TV. The distinction, I would say, in terms of connected TV adoption is the extent to which people are using those devices for the streaming of content rather than broadcast or cable or satellite or the traditional delivery methods. So in the US, it's really ramping up very, very quickly. I think that Nielsen's latest stats that we've tipped over into more than half of all TV consumption is now non-broadcast, non-cable linear TV. That's for good reason, because in the US, obviously, it's a different marketplace from what we see here in Europe, where they had these very high cost cable TV packages. So if you wanted to watch quality television, you had to pay for it, and you had to pay a lot. And suddenly the likes of Netflix, Amazon, increasingly then some of those same broadcast companies coming around, the Disneys and others, and fast, of course, you can have a cable-like experience for a fraction of the cost. So that is driving really rapid adoption in North America. In Europe, it's a bit slower CTV-wise. That's not to say, I think that the latest figures from Ofcom show that it's happening in the UK, but because of the amount of high-quality, premium, public service broadcasting, free-to-air TV that we have in a lot of markets in Western Europe, there isn't quite the same massive switchover that we're seeing in America. So, yeah, it's definitely happening, but it's happening at a slightly steadier pace.
And we're obviously seeing the market flooded with, relatively inexpensive smart TVs and connected TV devices now. And you can go in and you only have to spend a couple of £100 now to get something that is really, high quality, high definition piece of hardware that, you turn it on, the first thing you see is apps and the opportunity to watch content without signing up to any sort of cable package. So coming to FAST, you mentioned FAST earlier on, James. When it comes to FAST channels, what about consumption there? Are we talking about high concentrations of viewers watching FAST channels, or are we talking about, small pockets of thinly spread viewers? How's FAST been adopted?
Again, it depends a little bit where you're talking in terms of markets and regions. So if we look at the US, FAST is fulfilling a role, a gap in the market that wasn't there for high quality, well, not always, but sometimes high quality TV content that's free to access and ad supported. You don't need to take a subscription out in any sense. Obviously, we're seeing a huge rise in fast content in consumption in the US. I think Pluto TV, which is one of the big fast players in the US, you're talking about 80 million monthly active users. Its global viewing hours up by 35% year on year. And in that sense, fast really does seem to be helping to replace cable consumption. It's much scratchier and thinner on the ground when you talk about the UK and markets like that, because, as I've said, you've got so much great quality content available free to air or free to stream that it's much more about satisfying a niche audience with a fast channel. So that could be tailored around particular hobbies or pastimes. It could be somebody that just wants to watch Murder, She Wrote over and over and over again all day, every week. Let's be honest, a lot of the fast content is pretty rubbish. It's all packaged, repackaged stuff that they have kicking around. If you want to watch Never Ending Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, then it's the perfect place to do it. It's a more convenient viewing experience than watching it on YouTube. But for a lot of viewers in the UK, unless you're drawn to the subject and unless we see a real change in approach from the broadcast companies, I think it's going to be a bit more of a sort of that small packet of thinly spread viewers, to be honest.
What we've seen in the TV industry over the last 2-3 years is a lot of the distributors and rights holders have just literally thought, okay, well, we've got all this catalogue that's been sat on the shelf gathering dust for years. Great, we can make some money out of this. Let's go direct to consumer. Let's create a Baywatch channel, or let's put all our true crime content and create 1 or 2 channels there. And obviously, you can understand that. The success if it's not being licensed around anywhere. But you're right, when it comes to a viewing experience versus iPlayer in the UK, which you have completely free, and that's fresh, high quality content, you can understand the slightly slower rollout in the UK.
Yeah, I don't want to badmouth it too much. Some of the sort of smart TV, CTV companies, the likes of Samsung, for instance, are investing quite a lot in increasing the quality, and they're doing lots of partnerships, particularly in sport, because sports content has, over the last 10, 15 years, has absolutely been locked behind paywalls and subscription packages for a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic. And they're using fast channels to make some of that content available. On Samsung, you've got FIFA channels, you've got DAZN, DAZN, some of their sporting properties coming to Samsung's kind of fast channel package. So there is a little bit of movement in quality, but I'm still under the impression that the audiences are pretty small.
I actually have read recently, I think this week, that the FIA is considering launching a fast channel for a lot of their Formula One and also maybe Formula 2 and other motor racing content. So you can imagine this would be an attractive opportunity for sports bodies and rights holders there, bringing a relatively low-cost solution to building their sports and getting their sports action out there and being able to drive advertising against it, because I would imagine original content on connected TV and fast is that the highest performing type of content that you're seeing on fast?
It's certainly one of them. I think there is a huge amount of potential. You're absolutely right. If in some situation the FIA or FIFA or UEFA or whoever it might be, the IOC decided to pull all of their content and put it all through their own fast channels, there's a serious advertising revenue opportunity for them in doing that, because they would get a good audience. The trouble is, and this is where the sort of the kind of hard finance comes into it, is would they make more money doing that than they currently do by selling the rights? The answer is probably no. I mean, unless it's really confident about its advertising revenue potential, I doubt we'll see a situation where we're only seeing live coverage of Grand Prix or even of qualifying on its own properties. I think that's pretty unlikely.
It is a tantalising prospect, isn't it? As we're about to go into another round of negotiations for the Premier League rights coming up, and there's going to be more and more players out there, and this is, absolutely crucial for companies like Sky to retain their Premier League rights, which they have done for decades. It's always a very interesting round of negotiations when it comes up with new players like Amazon and various others in the mix as well. So talking about CTV advertising, how does connected TV advertising rank as a percentage of overall TV advertising?
according to our forecasts, the overall global TV market is worth about 180, 190 billion US dollars. Advertising is invariably measured in US dollars, so forgive for that for any European listeners. Some of our friends at Group M, which is part of WPP, have estimated that CTV ad investment this year is at about 26 billion US dollars. So you're talking less than 15%. So it's a pretty small portion at the moment.
In the States, it's started to overtake linear viewing. How about connected TV advertising as a proportion of overall TV advertising?
Again, it's market dependent. So in the US, you're absolutely right. We are now seeing a kind of real convergence between the amount of advertising going to CTV versus going to sort of traditional television. The US is by far and away the most advanced market down that particular path. Everywhere else, including the UK, CTV is a real minority, and it'll be less than 15%, I suspect. That is interesting in the sense that we're not completely seeing spend follow eyeballs. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that one of the big attractions of TV media for advertisers historically has been reach, mass reach. And there are fewer and fewer opportunities to hit a load of people at the same time with the same advertising message. Obviously, you can do a load of stuff on social media, YouTube, online video, where you can target particular audiences. But that mass reach thing, which is proven to be really useful in terms of campaign effectiveness, TV, as much as linear audiences are sort of bubbling downwards now, is a really important part of that. Advertisers are stuck with linear broadcast television in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily reflect what people are watching, particularly younger audiences. So that's maybe why we're not seeing quite the sort of balance that you'd expect if it was purely based on percentage of viewing.
And what sort of companies then, what sort of sectors are advertising on CTV then?
I mean, it's kind of all of the sectors that you'd expect. Retail is by far and away the biggest category in CTV, but it is in most media, to be honest. Media and publishing, unsurprisingly, is a big one, because I think that they see the opportunity to kind of really target those audiences with relevant content, particularly things like movies, TV shows, even sort of, print and that kind of thing as well. I'm just looking at the data from our report here, and then there's a whole cluster of categories in a bit of a pack. Things like financial services, tech, telecoms, pharma, all in a bit of a pack. So we don't necessarily see one or two, well, retailer side, we don't really see a lot of categories that are pulling away from the others. And ultimately, I think it's the ones that maybe have a little bit more in the way of data themselves, what we call first-party data. So they have their own customer data that they may be able to help bring to bear. So retailers, particularly online retailers, they'll have customer data, customers that are registered with their websites. Media and publishing, they'll sort of know who subscribes to their services, financial services, telecoms, etc. as well. They're the ones at the moment that maybe see the opportunity to bring some of their own customer data to bear in partnership with whichever CTV advertising platform they're working with. If you're advertising food or a drink or what we sort of call fast-moving consumer goods, there's maybe less of an appeal with CTV, because what you want to do is hit as many people as you possibly can to keep the sort of, your bucket as wide as possible, that then that person might not be in the market for a Mars bar this week or next week or even this month, but maybe in a couple of months down the line, something about that ad will lodge in their brain when they think, I fancy a chocolate bar. And that's the sort of, if the theory goes, that's how advertising, brand building advertising works.
When we look at CTV advertising as a percentage of advertising on social media, I imagine that's still a fairly small fraction. Do we expect to see growth in CTV advertising in relation to social media, do you think, in the coming months and years?
No, would be my honest answer. CTV it's tiny compared to what we see. So, social media, well, the whole of sort of what we describe as digital advertising, which is pure play internet advertising, because obviously there's a lot of places where the waters are muddied a little bit. But in terms of, internet advertising, that's more than $500 billion US dollar global market. It's huge, dominated, as you can expect, by the usual players, Google, Meta, Amazon, etc. Those guys are growing at a huge pace. They had a bit of a dip in 2022 and the beginning of this year, but they've really recovered very strongly now. CTV, we're seeing pretty solid growth, 10% a year roughly, forecast for the next 5 or 6 years. But at that pace, it's going to take, it'll take it forever to catch up with social media, and social media is growing faster than it in total terms, if not year-on-year terms. It's not that CTV is doing badly, by the way. I mean, 10% year-on-year for content-driven media is actually really good. We only really see that in very, very small media channels, things like podcasts, be digital out of home. It is very impressive overall, but if you compare it with what we're seeing, and actually quite an interesting example is with what we call retail media. So retail media is all of those annoying ads, sponsored ads on Amazon, or if you're in the States on Walmart or Kroger or Target. And they have been a relatively recent addition to the advertising world. And that is growing 3 times as fast as connected TV, which is sort of being hyped just as much, but is where retail media is succeeding is it's bringing in new ad dollars into the market from different places, different types of companies. Connected TV is ultimately fighting with other forms of TV for a very fixed pool that isn't really growing or contracting. And the fact it's not contracting, by the way, is a win in this advertising market. If we compare it with what's happened in print over the last 10, 15 years, TV's doing much better, but it's not growing. So I think what the report ultimately concludes is that CTV, much as there's a lot of excitement about it from an advertising perspective, is just ultimately replacing TV. In the long run, all TV will look like this.
There's no new money coming into CTV. It's just the replacement of linear advertising moving into CTV.
There's very little. There's a bit in terms of some of those direct-to-consumer, digitally native brands that might not have advertised on TV beforehand. The ones that sort of maybe would never have chosen to advertise on Sky or ITV in the UK, but it's not at the level that it needs to. So, if I use the example of Google, what Google did that was absolutely amazing was it created a product with its search advertising that suddenly appealed to literally tens or hundreds of thousands or even millions of businesses that would never have considered mainstream advertising. They would have never taken a radio ad out. They'd have never taken a TV out. They probably wouldn't have done a poster either. And they were like, well, actually, we can afford to do this at our own scale. And obviously, one corner shop isn't going to make a massive media business. But then if there's 10 million of those, suddenly you're gaining a huge amount of money that wasn't really in the system already. That's what Google did. It's kind of what Facebook and some of the social media companies have done as well. And that is a whole wedge of the advertising market that Telly's never really been able to capture, other than, as I said, ironically, in the sort of pre-national TV channels, for instance, in the UK, when ITV was split by region, you did see some of those companies advertising on TV. They are the companies that TV, or CTV, should I say, needs to attract, needs to bring on board, and needs to persuade that actually some of the stuff you think is really cool that you can do with Google, where you can target by households, target people that are probably going to be in market, they might come on board, but we haven't seen it yet at scale.
I'm sure that's the biggest challenge for lots of CTV salespeople out there looking to sell more and more ads. And just finally, Alex, the overall picture, advertising budgets have been in decline over the last year or so. What's the general outlook for 2024? Will we see advertisers returning to TV as a whole, not just CTV? Can you give us any crumbs of comfort, anything to look forward to in 2024? Are we, a brand's going to start advertising again? Are commercial broadcasters going to start to be commissioning as a result of that? How's things looking for next year?
The picture looked better for 2024. So we just released some forecasts for the advertising market a few weeks ago. And yeah, I mean, look, it's been a really tough year for the TV overall. So the sort of wider TV sector, which we refer to as premium video for reasons I'm not 100% clear, but we're forecasting that it'll be down 3.1% this year. And that's a 5.4% dip for linear TV because CTV is growing. Next year, we're forecasting that linear TV will return to growth. We're predicting a 3.5% increase, which would take the wider TV market up to near enough, just short of $200 million worldwide. There's a few reasons for that. I think one is we are seeing a bit of confidence, touch wood, let's not jinx it, but a bit of confidence coming back into the market with brands. The cost of living crisis isn't over, but as we've seen, regrettably with the war in Ukraine, as marketeers and brands adapt, there's an initial shock. Their instinct is usually to pull spend in the moment. As the situation normalizes, they become more confident. And also, as I said, to that point, they need to build future demand. They need to be advertising on channels like TV to try and fill up the pipeline again. You can only do so much if you're targeting people already in market. So you need to get more people in market, and you do that by building your brand, by building the category. And TV is pretty much the best channel you can possibly use to do that. We think there's a sense of a rising tide that's going to help TV. There's a couple of big moments coming up next year, as I'm sure your listeners will be aware. Obviously, we've got some big sporting events, things like the Olympics. Obviously, although it's not a huge advertising play in the UK because of the BBC coverage, it is in other places. You've got the US presidential election, which always has a bit of an effect, particularly at the back end of the year. Yeah, in general, I think there's just a bit of confidence that there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of knowledge that TV advertising works. And I think the TV industry is getting better at selling that story. It's just been a tough year. It was a tough year for all corners of the industry, apart from a couple of places, TikTok, Amazon, that were able to ride it out. We saw Facebook and Instagram, well, not Instagram specifically, but Meta and Facebook, register their first ever year-on-year losses over the last kind of 12 months. So TV isn't the only one that's hurt, put it that way. We see TV bouncing back in a way that we maybe don't with some of the other parts of the market. Things like publishing are going to continue to struggle probably.
The final thing I'd say is that something that James mentioned when we had our chat back at Cannes Lions was one of the reasons, which I hadn't thought about, for the drop in advertising wasn't just about increased cost of advertising, it was increased cost of production, which obviously is a huge consideration for advertisers. I guess that's not going away, right? I mean, the fact is that inflation has caused those, it seems to be leveling out. So maybe in 6-8 months' time, that inflation will be stable or falling a little bit. Listen, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Really great to hear your insight. And that's a really interesting report that you published. And we'll include a link in the episode description. So if anybody wants to go in and have a look at the report in any more detail, it's a really detailed piece of work. So congratulations on that. And hopefully we'll chat again in a few months' time, maybe at Cannes Lions again, and everybody will be in a much different frame of mind. TV advertising will be back, and everybody will be happy, hopefully.
Yeah, let's hope so. And these things are always taste better with a cold glass of rosé in the hand.
As does everything. That's it. All right. Thanks a lot, Alex. Great to speak to you. Well, that's about it for another week's show. A quick note to let you know the early bird ticket offer for the TellyCast Digital Content Forum, sponsored by BBC Studios, expires on Saturday, the 30th of September. So if you're planning on coming along and want the best ticket deal, get your tickets now. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers and recorded for the last time at Elstree Studios, just north of London. Next week's show features Anna de Moraes from Multistory Media and Lucy Smith with all the latest news on what to expect from this year's MIPCOM. Till then, stay safe,